It looks pretty much like a war zone. Trees, stumps, everything back there. Then I asked them to think about how they see that landscape today, and for them, oh, it's natural, it's wild, it's about as wild as the Palouse wheat crops are, in terms of it's a highly cultivated, highly managed place. Now, it doesn't make it any less beautiful, but it is a landscape that has been heavily manipulated by the presence of people. A student of mine a while back did a very interesting study comparing the coal mines that we'll talk about a little bit tonight. You guys saw that Harold trumped me on this, but over the weekend, the little piece about the coal mines that came out. But my students did it, the student did a comparison of the coal mines and Cornwall Park. And his argument was they're the same thing. The park is structured so that people interact with the landscape in the same way that the mine is structured so that people can interact with that landscape. They both direct you in and out in certain ways to take certain things away from the experience in the park. So if that seems kind of esoteric and weird, well, maybe it'll make more sense later in the night. So a couple of you were looking a little bit skeptical, but now, there are much earlier terms in public history. Much of public history started quite early, really in the late 19th century, as people look back, in the United States anyway, to old historic sites, early houses, early architecture of very, very early settlers, to kind of create a sense of antiquity in the United States that we don't really have in comparison to many spots in Europe. We're as good as Europe, then where are our old buildings? Oh, it's here. It's in this location. They tended to focus on elite sites of high culture that they thought were worthy of salvage. And by the way, this glorious structure that's ours in this picture would not have been included, because earlier on they were looking at really 17th and 18th century structures, not necessarily late 19th century structures. By the 1930s, a place like our courthouse here in the picture would have been considered one of those early sites of architecture that we would have placed here on a pedestal as this is a place worthy of knowing and studying. Beginning in the 1930s, specialists started talking more about built environment rather than historic architecture, which allowed them eventually to include things like the WPA Bridge in Whatcom Falls Park that many of you know about. This building, City Hall, built in 1938 as a part of a WPA project. But even ultimately things that we treasure so much in Bellingham, those craftsman-style bungalow houses that people like Catherine live in. Actually, those were considered early on in this time frame too mundane and common. Those were the ranch houses of the 1930s, 20s and 30s were the bungalows. Those were the big tract developments that were being produced at the time. Now we see them as essential to the character of our town, right? Most of our historic districts are populated by these houses, especially as we broaden that definition out. So the term landscape got used then in the 1990s to begin to think about other types of places. Places like Georgia Pacific. There's a landscape with lots of human interaction. There's a place that's certainly a part of the history of Bellingham, and yet we might look past it as a kind of rusting, decrepit, declining waterfront, unless we were trying to incorporate consciously places like this rather than the beautiful courthouse. It also includes places like the Woodstock Farm here on the way to Larrabee State Park. And one of the great things about this particular park here, and I'll try to put my cursor so that you can see it, that really gets us at landscape. We've got the farm area, we've got the wonderful buildings. What really intrigues me is the tide flat and the railroad tracks. Tidal action, because of the building of the tracks, tidal action behind here has silted all this up. And that is no more natural than the railroad, but yet it's very much a part of the landscape. So we would even think about how things are transformed by human impact, even in recent years. There are two key programs that we've been involved in the early stages of this public history program here and the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies are an oral history project in and around Georgia Pacific. The second one that I'll talk in a little bit more detail about then tonight are the historic neighborhood surveys taking place right now. Nobody's here from the city tonight, but Katie Frank's working with the city of Bellingham, and the Magnolia Courts is a great spot there in the York district. The Walking Museum and the Bellingham Public Library, along with volunteers from a number of different neighborhoods, are very important in trying to put this together. Now, in that early Georgia Pacific waterfront history, and we sort of stumbled into that. Over a couple quarters, I got about 20 students committed, which is sometimes hard to do, to go off campus and interview a number of people who had worked at Georgia Pacific before it was really fully shut down and these people had moved on to other places and other stages in their lives. We ended up doing 18 oral histories. Some of those names may be familiar to some of you. I know my father knows Ken Blackmore from out at the airport and other places. But a long list of people, certainly not comprehensive, but many who worked in a lot of different places and facilities within Georgia Pacific. Now this is at that site now where the university and the city are talking about what do we do here, how can we develop this, what can we do with it. And I saw part of our role as capturing what this site meant to several generations of people in Bellingham. Most of our students, when they first started learning about this, because one of the things I required them to do was understand what is a pulp mill, what does it do, what are the actual processes there, what are the different jobs that people have. Most of our students started with the impression that this place was evil. It is a polluter, it's a nasty thing. Not necessarily untrue, and yet what they came to understand as they talked to the people who had worked there, as they listened to the people whose lives had been involved and deeply embedded in this community and in working at that site, is that it was very much a part of the life and livelihood of this place during that time. In fact, our students at Western are migrant birds. They come seasonally and they leave. In spite of the fact that you think that every job in town is occupied by a former Western graduate, most of them are very transitory. They have no sense of the place. They have no sense even of the university. The university exists in their minds in a 4 or 5 or 6 year time span, depending on the students, and then they're gone. They don't see a depth of meaning at the place that allows them to understand that the Georgia Pacific closure is the tail end of the industrial era here that really has been a century or more in the making. They don't see a waterfront occupied by 14 mills and all number of salmon canneries that were the lifeblood of this place. Dean Kleinknecht came to Western what year? 1970. 3 years after the closure of the Pacific American Fisheries Plant, once the largest cannery in the world. You're a newcomer. You've lived in a deindustrializing Bellingham. It's taken most of your career. But that's the world that he's seen and lived with. Our students don't see that. They don't see a depth of place, a depth of meaning in the landscape. They got there. They started to get there, this small group of students. And one of them produced this film, Smells Like Money. And I'll give a pitch for it. You can buy it, I think, at Henderson's for 20 bucks. There's the price tag. That's how much I paid for my copy. But, and what these students did, and he among them, I'll read the text here for you. The pulp mill on Bellingham's waterfront was more than just a pulp mill to its employees, for whom the plant represented stability, innovation, and many close friendships. This film deals with the story of the pulp mill using a combination of interviews, images, historic film clips, newspaper articles, television reports to show the human side of a place and people that many have labeled their enemy. This is a huge transformation for a student who told me at the beginning that he really did think he was going to uncover the dirt about this nasty, horrible place that had fouled Bellingham's waterfront. This is a depth of maturity and understanding, and I'm really, really proud of his ability to make that transition. Now, the people he interviewed weren't about to say that they had fouled this place, and because they did not understand their participation in that way and refused to tell him otherwise. So there's a good lesson for the creation of history, the nature of your documents, but also the transition into something else other than what the original assumption was going to be. This material lives on then as part of our obligation to history in the archives at the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies. All of the materials that I collected for the students, the papers that they wrote, the journals that the students wrote, the interviews that they did, the raw footage that the one student shot to make the film, is all there for the archival record, so that somebody else interested in this thing can also go back, look at those same documents rather than relying on just what the student gleaned from them. And so those have a continued life. So when I look down out over the bay from Western, and I see GP, I see part of what wasn't a long-standing industrial waterfront and the closure of one episode. I see a student transformed and a place transforming simultaneously. That there's a complexity to that place that I keep adding to, and in the addition, I'm hoping things are not being taken away. Memory may prove me wrong on that. The next speaker's on what? Oh, Alzheimer's. Yeah, that's right. Okay. I have a terrible sense of humor. I mean, it's not good, but the other major thing that we're engaged in right now as a big part of the public history program, and when I say we, I mean they, Forrest and Natalie are in the back up there. And how many hours did you spend going through microfilm this week? Countless, by the look on your face. They're engaged in doing some research that I'll tell you about in a second. There are historic neighborhoods, as many of you know, already in Bellingham. It's part of a process by which local tax breaks and considerations can be given, and it's a way to preserve the character of the communities, especially within the town. Seaholm Hill has been a recent addition. The neighborhoods got together with the city to develop a sort of broader plan. In the more recent iteration of this, there's a neighborhood survey in anticipation of nominating whole districts here as historic districts. And those include the lettered streets, South Hill, which I couldn't find their sign. It must be there someplace. And the York District are the three districts that the city is working with right now and with those neighborhood associations. And I'll hazard a guess that some of you here are in those neighborhoods or in those neighborhood associations. There have been multiple meetings, so fresh meat then for the cause here. What happened is several years ago, well, this gives you a sense of the existing historic districts and sites downtown. A number of buildings have been nominated from downtown as historic buildings, but the integrity of the whole area downtown has been shifted enough over time that it's difficult to nominate the whole area as a historic district And by the way, historic in this sense